I thought our separation would save my marriage, instead it changed my entire identity. I've been married to my husband for almost 8 years, and until recently, I genuinely believed we'd spend the rest of our lives together. We met when we were both in our early 20s, still figuring out who we were and what we wanted from life. We grew up together in a lot of ways. We celebrated promotions, survived job losses, moved into our first apartment with furniture we found on Facebook Marketplace, adopted a dog that chewed through 2 couches, and slowly built what everyone around us called the perfect marriage. From the outside, I understand why people thought that. We never fought loudly, we never embarrassed each other in public, and our social media looked exactly like every happy couple's highlight reel. But what people didn't see were the quiet moments after dinner when we'd sit in the same room without saying a single word. They didn't see how conversations that used to last until 2 in the morning had turned into discussions about grocery lists, utility bills, and whose turn it was to take the dog to the vet. Somewhere along the way, we stopped being partners who dreamed together and became roommates who simply shared responsibilities. Neither of us cheated. Neither of us was abusive. There wasn't one dramatic event that destroyed our relationship. It was more like watching a candle slowly burn out until one day you realize the room has gone dark. The conversation that changed everything happened on a rainy Thursday evening. My husband looked exhausted when he came home from work, and honestly, so did I. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, barely touching the dinner I'd spent an hour making. Finally, he sighed and asked me a question that caught me completely off guard. He asked if I was still happy, not if I still loved him, but if I was happy. I remember staring at my plate because I couldn't answer him immediately. After what felt like forever, I admitted that I didn't know anymore. His eyes filled with tears before mine did, and he confessed he'd been feeling exactly the same way. We weren't angry at each other. If anything, we felt guilty for disappointing one another. That night we talked longer than we had in years. We admitted we'd been pretending everything was fine, because we were terrified of what it would mean if it wasn't. By the end of the conversation, we agreed to try something neither of us had ever imagined: a 3-month separation. No lawyers, no dating rules, no promises about what would happen afterward. Just time apart to figure out whether we truly missed each other or whether we were only staying together because we'd grown comfortable. Moving into my own apartment felt strangely peaceful. I expected to cry myself to sleep every night, but instead I felt quiet. For the first time in years, I could hear my own thoughts. I decorated the tiny apartment exactly how I wanted, bought plants I'd probably forget to water, and started saying yes to things I'd always declined before. My co-workers noticed the change almost immediately. They invited me out after work more often, and instead of making excuses about needing to get home, I actually joined them. It was during one of those evenings that I met someone who would completely change the direction of my life. Her name was Maya. She wasn't part of our company, but she was a friend of one of my co-workers and had tagged along for trivia night at a local cafe. She wasn't the loudest person in the room or the one trying to be the center of attention. What stood out was how easy she was to talk to. Within 15 minutes we were laughing over childhood stories and teasing each other about our terrible trivia answers as if we'd known each other for years. When I left that night, I realized something that genuinely surprised me. I couldn't remember the last time I'd laughed that much. Over the next few weeks, Maya and I kept running into each other through mutual friends. Sometimes we'd all grab coffee after work. Other times we'd meet for weekend hikes or browse bookstores together. Nothing about it felt unusual at first. I simply thought I'd made a new friend during a confusing chapter of my life. She never pressured me to talk about my marriage, but whenever I wanted to, she listened without interrupting or trying to fix anything. She remembered little details I'd mentioned weeks earlier, like the name of my childhood dog or my favorite author. One afternoon she surprised me by bringing me a second-hand copy of a novel I'd mentioned loving as a teenager. It wasn't an expensive gift, but the thought behind it stayed with me for days. I couldn't remember the last time someone had paid such close attention to the small things I said. As my separation continued, I noticed something else changing. I looked forward to hearing from Maya in a way I couldn't explain. If my phone buzzed and it was her asking how my day was going, I'd smile before I even opened the message. We started spending time together outside of group settings, grabbing lunch on weekends, or walking through the city with no real destination. Hours seemed to disappear whenever we talked. We discussed everything from childhood dreams to fears about growing older. For the first time in years, I felt completely seen. She never judged me for admitting I felt lost. Instead, she'd ask questions that made me think about who I was outside of being someone's wife. It was both comforting and terrifying because I realized I didn't have many answers. One evening, After we'd spent nearly 4 hours talking at a quiet park, I drove home feeling strangely emotional. I sat in my car outside my apartment long after I'd parked, trying to understand why. I kept replaying our conversations in my head and comparing them to the life I'd left behind. The comparison made me feel guilty almost immediately. I wasn't supposed to be measuring one relationship against another. The whole point of the separation was to figure myself out, not become attached to someone new. I reminded myself over and over that Maya was just a friend, that I was simply enjoying having someone who understood me. But deep down, a question had begun to form, one I wasn't ready to say out loud because even thinking it felt like opening a door that could never be closed again. Then, just as I was beginning to settle into this new version of my life, my husband called unexpectedly. His voice sounded hopeful in a way I hadn't heard for months. He told me he'd been going to therapy, working on himself, and thinking about us every single day. He asked if we could meet for dinner the following weekend to talk about where we stood. I agreed before I had time to think it through. The moment I hung up, my heart started racing, not because I was excited, but because for the first time since our separation began, I wasn't sure what I wanted anymore. And that realization scared me more than anything else. When Saturday finally arrived, I spent nearly an hour deciding what to wear. It sounds ridiculous now, but I wasn't dressing to impress my husband. I was dressing because I had no idea which version of myself was walking into that restaurant. Was I the wife trying to repair her marriage, or was I someone who had quietly changed during the weeks we'd spent apart? Those questions followed me the entire drive. When I saw him waiting outside, something inside me softened. He looked familiar in the way only someone who's shared years of your life can. We hugged awkwardly, sat down, ordered food, and for the first 20 minutes it almost felt like nothing had changed. We talked about work, our families, and even laughed about our dog's latest attempt to destroy the living room. But eventually the conversation became unavoidable. He looked directly at me and admitted that the separation had made him realize how much he'd taken our relationship for granted. He apologized for becoming emotionally distant, for assuming I'd always be there, and for letting routine replace romance. It was the most vulnerable I'd seen him in years, and every word he said was sincere. The problem was that while he was describing the future he hoped we could rebuild, I realized I couldn't picture myself in it anymore. Driving home that night, I cried harder than I had since the separation began. Not because I hated him, but because I still cared about him deeply. He wasn't a bad husband. In many ways, he had become a better man during the weeks we'd been apart. The cruel timing of it all wasn't lost on me. It felt as though we'd both started growing, but we were growing in different directions. I kept wondering if I owed it to our marriage to keep trying. After all, people fight for relationships all the time. Marriage isn't supposed to be easy. Every article, every older couple, every piece of advice I'd ever heard said love was a choice you made over and over again. So why did choosing it suddenly feel like I was betraying myself? That thought haunted me for days because it made me feel selfish, and I'd never seen myself as someone who walked away from commitment. A few evenings later, Maya noticed something was wrong before I even said a word. We were sitting on a bench overlooking a small lake after taking a long walk, and I must have seemed distracted because she gently asked if I wanted to talk. I ended up telling her everything about the dinner with my husband, how he'd apologized, how genuine he seemed, and how guilty I felt for not immediately wanting to go back. She listened quietly, never interrupting. When I finished, she didn't tell me what decision to make. Instead, she asked one simple question that stayed with me for weeks. If you had no fear of disappointing anyone, what would your heart choose? I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out. I genuinely didn't know. Or maybe I did know and I was too afraid to admit it. Over the following month, I became increasingly aware of feelings I'd spent most of my life ignoring. Looking back, I started remembering moments from my teenage years that I'd brushed off as admiration or curiosity. I remembered developing unusually intense friendships with certain girls, feeling nervous around some women in ways I could never explain, and convincing myself everyone experienced those emotions. I had grown up in a community where there wasn't much room to question who you were. The expectation was simple. You grow up, meet someone of the opposite sex, get married, have children, and build a family. I followed that path because it felt like the only one available. I loved my husband in a real way, but now I found myself wondering whether I'd mistaken comfort, companionship, and genuine affection for complete fulfillment. That realization didn't make me feel relieved. It made me feel terrified because it forced me to question nearly everything I believed about myself. Around that same time, Maya and I started spending less time in groups and more time alone. We'd visit museums, explore little cafes we'd never heard of, or simply sit for hours talking about life. What struck me most wasn't excitement or butterflies, it was peace. I never felt like I had to perform around her. There was no pressure to be funnier, prettier, or more interesting. I could admit my fears, my regrets, and even my confusion without worrying she'd judge me. One rainy afternoon, while we were hiding under the awning of a bookstore waiting for the storm to pass, she looked at me with a seriousness I'd never seen before. She quietly admitted that she'd developed feelings for me. She immediately added that she wasn't expecting anything in return and didn't want to complicate my already difficult situation. She simply felt it was unfair to keep pretending those feelings didn't exist. My heart pounded so loudly I was certain she could hear it. Instead of responding, I asked for some time because I honestly didn't know what I was feeling. That conversation changed everything. For days afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about her words. I replayed every moment we'd shared, every conversation, every laugh, every comfortable silence. The feelings I'd been trying to ignore suddenly became impossible to push aside. I realized that what I admired most about Maya wasn't how she made me feel special. It was how she made me feel like myself. That difference mattered more than I could explain. Yet every time I imagined pursuing those feelings, I also pictured my husband sitting alone in our old house, believing there was still a chance we'd find our way back to each other. The guilt became almost unbearable. I started avoiding both of them, because I didn't want to hurt either person. While I sorted through emotions, I barely understood myself. Then one evening, my husband called again. This time his voice carried optimism. He told me he'd found a couples therapist who specialized in helping separated spouses reconnect. He'd already scheduled an appointment and wanted to know if I'd be willing to attend with him. He sounded hopeful, almost excited, as though he could finally see the finish line after months of uncertainty. My stomach immediately tightened. I stared at my phone for what felt like forever before quietly telling him I needed more time. There was a long silence on the other end before he finally asked the question I'd been dreading. Is there someone else? I froze. Technically, nothing inappropriate had happened between Maya and me, but emotionally, I knew my heart had already begun moving somewhere I never expected it to go. For several seconds I couldn't speak. Finally I whispered, I don't know how to answer that. He didn't yell, he didn't accuse me of anything. Instead his voice cracked as he asked if I still loved him. Tears immediately filled my eyes because the answer wasn't simple. I do love you, I admitted honestly, but I don't know if I'm still the person you married. Neither of us said another word for what felt like an eternity. Eventually, he quietly said he understood that I needed to figure things out, but he also admitted he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep hopping. When the call ended, I sat alone in my apartment staring out the window as the sun disappeared behind the buildings. For the first time, I realized that no matter what choice I made, someone was going to leave this story with a broken heart. The next few weeks became the most emotionally exhausting period of my life. Every morning I woke up hoping I'd suddenly have clarity, that some magical realization would tell me exactly what to do. Instead, I found myself feeling pulled in two completely different directions. One direction was the life I'd spent nearly a decade building with my husband, a life filled with memories, traditions, shared struggles, and genuine love. The other was a future I had never imagined for myself, one that felt uncertain, frightening, and impossible to explain to the people who knew me. I stopped asking myself which choice would make everyone else happy because I'd finally realized that wasn't possible. No matter what happened next, someone would be disappointed. My husband would lose the future he was desperately trying to save. My family would struggle to understand why I was walking away from a marriage that, from the outside, looked perfectly healthy. Even Maya had told me more than once that she didn't want to be the reason my marriage ended. The truth was, this wasn't about choosing one person over another anymore. It was about figuring out whether I could continue pretending to be someone I no longer recognized. Eventually, I agreed to meet my husband one last time before making any final decisions. We met at the same small cafe where we'd had our very first date years earlier. Sitting across from him brought back memories I'd almost forgotten, the excitement of planning our future together, the jokes only we understood, the dreams we'd made when life seemed much simpler. For a brief moment, I wondered if I was making the biggest mistake of my life. He smiled sadly and told me he still believed we could fix what had broken between us. He spoke about counseling, taking vacations together, making more time for each other, and starting over from the beginning. I listened to every word because he deserved to be heard. When he finished, there was a long silence between us. Finally, I reached across the table, held his hand, and admitted something I'd barely been able to admit to myself. I told him that although I would always love him, The person I'd become during our time apart couldn't ignore what she'd discovered about herself. My tears started falling before I'd even finished the sentence. His eyes filled with tears too, but he didn't interrupt. He simply nodded, as if somewhere deep down he'd already sensed this conversation was coming. Walking away from that kafar was one of the hardest things I've ever done. There was no dramatic argument, no shouting, no slammed doors. Just two people who had genuinely loved each other realizing that love alone wasn't enough to erase the truth. We agreed to file for divorce respectfully without trying to punish one another. We divided our belongings peacefully, shared custody of our dog, and promised not to turn each other into villains when people asked what had happened. Keeping that promise wasn't always easy. Friends wanted someone to blame. Some assumed I'd cheated. Others believed my husband must have done something terrible. The reality disappointed people because there wasn't a scandal. There were just two people whose lives had quietly drifted apart until one of them finally admitted it. Telling my family was somehow even harder than ending my marriage. They couldn't understand why I'd leave such a stable relationship. When I eventually explained that I'd been questioning my sexuality, the room became painfully quiet. A few relatives tried to convince me I was simply confused because I'd been lonely during the separation. Others insisted I was throwing away years of marriage over temporary feelings. One family member even suggested I was having a midlife crisis, which would have been funny if it hadn't hurt so much. Not everyone reacted badly though. My younger sister surprised me the most. She hugged me before I finished explaining and simply said, "I'd rather have an honest sister than an unhappy one." Those words became something I held onto whenever the criticism became overwhelming. As for Maya, things weren't magically perfect after my divorce. If anything, we moved incredibly slowly. Neither of us wanted our relationship to begin with unrealistic expectations or become defined by the ending of my marriage. We spent months simply getting to know each other outside of the emotional chaos that had brought us together. There were awkward conversations, moments where I questioned whether I was making the right decision, and days when I mourned the life I'd left behind. Healing isn't a straight line, and discovering something important about yourself doesn't instantly erase grief. I learned that you can miss someone deeply while still knowing the relationship has reached its natural end. Those emotions can exist together, no matter how confusing they seem. About a year later, something happened that I never expected. My ex-husband asked if we could meet for coffee. I was nervous, wondering if old wounds would reopen, but the meeting turned out to be surprisingly peaceful. He looked happier than the last time I'd seen him. He'd started dating again, had adopted another dog, and seemed genuinely excited about the future. At one point, he smiled and admitted something that caught me completely off guard. He said the divorce had forced him to become a better version of himself, even though he'd never chosen that path voluntarily. Then he looked at me and thanked me for being honest instead of staying in a marriage out of guilt. Hearing those words lifted a weight I'd been carrying ever since our separation began. For the first time, I truly believed we'd both be okay. Today, when I look back, I don't see my marriage as a failure. I see it as an important chapter of my life that helped shape who I became. My husband wasn't the wrong person. He was the right person for the version of me that existed back then. People change, sometimes in ways they never expect. That doesn't erase the love that once existed or make those years meaningless. It simply means life doesn't always follow the plan we created in our 20s. I know some people will judge my choices, and honestly I understand why. If someone had told me 10 years ago that this would become my story, I probably wouldn't have believed them either. But pretending to be someone else would have been unfair to everyone involved, especially the man who deserved someone who could love him completely. If there's one lesson I've learned through all of this, it's that the hardest truths are often the ones we spend years trying to avoid. Ignoring them doesn't make them disappear, it only delays the moment we finally have to face them. Being honest may cost you relationships, routines, and the future you thought you wanted, but living a life that isn't truly yours comes with an even greater cost. I don't know what the future holds, but for the first time in a very long time, I'm no longer afraid of discovering who I really am. What would you have done if you were in my husband's shoes? Would you have fought to save the marriage or accepted that sometimes love isn't enough? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe, like, share and comment.